My son threw it in my face that I had never helped him. I only smiled and said nothing. My whole life, I kept 2 ledgers, one for the taxman and one for his future. He, a man of finance and success, saw nothing in me but an old man smelling of sawdust and wood stain. He never knew the foundation of his shining life was built not in a bank, but in my dusty workshop, secured not by interest, but by the price of my own silent, buried dreams. Today, he will read that book to the very last page. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. The day began long before the sun had cleared the jagged tops of the pine trees that stood like silent sentinels around my property. I woke not to an alarm, but to a subtle shift in the quality of the darkness, a thinning of the black ink outside my window to a deep, washed-out navy. It was a clock I had kept inside me for over 50 years. My body knew the time was 5:15 a.m., even if my eyes were still closed. For a moment, I lay perfectly still under the heavy quilt, listening to the profound silence of the house. It was a quiet born, not of emptiness, but of presence. The gentle hum of the old refrigerator downstairs, the groaning sigh of the house settling in the cool Maine air, the whisper of my own breathing. These were the sounds of my life, the steady, predictable rhythm against which everything else was measured. Getting out of bed at 72 was a slow, deliberate process, a negotiation with gravity and the ghosts of past labors. My back sent a familiar, dull ache up my spine, and my knees clicked in protest as I swung my legs over the side of the mattress. The floorboards were cold under my bare feet, a shock that sharpened the senses. I reached for the flannel robe draped over the chair, its fabric worn to an impossible softness. A second skin. Eleanor had mended the left elbow with a dark blue patch almost 2 decades ago, and my fingers found the raised stitching in the dark, a small, tangible piece of her that remained. The walk to the bathroom was a short journey through a museum of my own life. I passed the dresser where our wedding photograph sat, her smile still managing to outshine the faded silver of the frame. In the dim light, her eyes seemed to follow me. I paused, as I often did, and ran a thumb over the dusty glass. In the bathroom, I avoided looking at myself in the mirror right away. I splashed my face with cold water from the tap, the shock of it a bracing ritual that peeled away the last layers of sleep. Only then did I raise my head and meet the gaze of the stranger who lived in my reflection. The man looking back at me was a testament to time's relentless carpentry. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, lines carved by laughter, worry, and countless hours squinting against sun and sawdust. His hair, once the color of dark walnut, was now a thin silver crown. It was his hands, resting on the edges of the porcelain sink, that told the truer story. They were large and gnarled, the knuckles swollen like knots in an old oak branch. Scars, pale and white, crisscrossed the skin, souvenirs from a slipped chisel, a careless saw blade, a lifetime of shaping wood. These hands had built a life, had held my newborn son, had comforted my dying wife. Now they trembled slightly as I picked up my toothbrush. Downstairs, the air was still and cool, carrying the faint, layered scents of my world, the sweet perfume of old wood, the sharp tang of turpentine from the workshop in the basement, and the ghost of lemon polish, the kind Eleanor always used. I moved through the quiet rooms, my slippers whispering on the worn hardwood floors. Today was different. Today, Robert was coming. He and his wife, Anne, and the grandchildren, Lily and Jake. Their visits were infrequent, scheduled events that appeared on my calendar like national holidays, circled in red ink. And like a holiday, they required preparation. I had spent all of yesterday getting the house ready, but a nervous energy propelled me to check everything again. In the kitchen, I ran a hand over the already spotless countertops. The old gas stove gleamed. The copper-bottomed pots, a wedding gift from 53 years ago, hung in a neat, polished row above it. Everything had to be just so. Robert, a successful man who lived in a world of clean lines and minimalist design, always seemed to notice the small imperfections in my home. His eyes catching on a piece of peeling paint or a worn spot on a rug, with the precision of an auditor finding a discrepancy in a ledger. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the click of the burner igniting sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. While it heated, I walked into the living room. The furniture in this room was a collection of my life's work. The mahogany bookshelf, the cherrywood coffee table, the oak rocking chair near the fireplace. I had built them all with my own hands, designing them to last for generations. They were heavy, solid, and honest. I ran a dust cloth over the mantelpiece, lingering on the framed photos. Robert as a gap-toothed 7-year-old, proudly holding up a small lopsided birdhouse we had built together. Robert graduating from college, his face beaming, his arm around me and Eleanor. She had been so proud that day, her eyes shining with a light that had nothing to do with the camera's flash. The kettle whistled, a piercing shriek that pulled me from my thoughts. Back in the kitchen, I spooned instant coffee into my favorite mug, the one with the faded "World's Best Dad" slogan. It was a simple bitter brew, but it was my ritual. I took the mug to the kitchen table and sat in my usual chair, the one that offered a clear view of the bird feeder in the backyard. The sun was finally rising, casting long, soft shadows across the lawn. A blue jay, bold and loud, landed on the feeder, scattering a flock of smaller sparrows. I watched them, my mind a quiet blank for a few precious moments. The illusion of an ordinary day was nearly complete. But beneath the surface of my calm routine, a current of anxiety flowed. I opened the refrigerator and looked at the roast I had prepared. I had followed Eleanor's recipe precisely, rubbing the meat with garlic, rosemary, and salt, just as she had taught me. I wanted the meal to be perfect, a taste of a past he seemed to have forgotten. I wanted the house to feel like a home, not a museum. Later in the morning, I retrieved the silver from the sideboard. It was Eleanor's pride and joy, her family's silverware, heavy and ornate. I laid it all out on a soft towel on the kitchen table, the forks, the knives, the spoons. One by one, I polished each piece, the familiar cloying scent of the polish filling the air. As I rubbed away the tarnish, I saw a distorted reflection of my own face in the curve of a spoon. It was the face of a man preparing for an inspection, not a family visit. Each pass of the cloth was an attempt to erase any sign of neglect, any evidence that I was just an old man living alone. I was trying to prove something, though I wasn't entirely sure what, that I was still capable, that my world, though small and quiet, was still orderly and dignified, that I was worthy of the fleeting attention of my successful son. When the last spoon was polished to a brilliant shine, I carefully set the table. The white porcelain plates, the starched linen napkins, the gleaming silver. The stage was set. I had done everything I could. I sat in the old armchair in the living room, the one with the permanent impression of my body in its cushions, and I waited. The grandfather clock in the hall, another piece I had built and kept running for 40 years, began to chime noon. Its deep, resonant bongs marked the end of my quiet morning, the end of the illusion. Soon the sound of a car engine on the gravel driveway would break the peace, and my carefully constructed world would have to face the judgment of the world outside. They arrived precisely at noon, the crunch of their tires on my gravel driveway sounding as loud and intrusive as a rock slide. I watched from the living room window as the vehicle came to a stop, a machine that seemed too large and too black for the gentle greens and browns of my corner of the world. It was a luxury SUV, polished to a mirror shine, a stark declaration of a life lived far from dusty workshops and quiet woods. The doors opened and my family spilled out, not so much arriving as deploying. Robert emerged first from the driver's side, tall and confident in a way that always seemed to take up more space than his physical form required. He wore a crisp polo shirt and expensive-looking pants that were neither jeans nor slacks, a uniform for a life of casual success. His wife, Anne, followed, a cloud of floral perfume preceding her, a scent so potent it seemed to seep through the window glass. She moved with a quick, bird-like energy, her eyes scanning my small house with an expression that was polite but evaluative. And then the children, Lily and Jake, my grandchildren, unfolded themselves from the back seat. They were teenagers now, heads perpetually bent toward the glowing screens in their hands, their thumbs moving in a silent, frantic dance. They were plugged into a different universe, and my front porch was merely a temporary, uninteresting loading zone. The embrace I received from my son on the porch was brief and perfunctory, a firm, one-armed hug accompanied by a few solid pats on the back. It was the gesture of a busy man acknowledging a duty. Anne's kiss landed somewhere in the air beside my cheek, a whisper of contact. The grandchildren offered mumbled greetings, their eyes barely leaving their devices as they brushed past me into the house, their first question an inquiry about the Wi-Fi password. They moved through my home like tourists in a quaint museum, their presence loud even in its silence. The house, which had felt so calm and ordered just moments before, suddenly seemed small and cluttered, filled with their restless energy. Anne placed her designer handbag, a piece of immaculate leather that probably cost more than my first truck, onto the cherry wood coffee table I had spent a month building. The soft thud it made seemed to echo, a sound of two worlds colliding. I watched as Robert's gaze swept across the room, his eyes not seeing the history in the hand-carved mantelpiece or the love in the worn armchair, but rather cataloging what was old, what was faded, what was, in his world, inadequate. We sat down at the dining table, the one I had so carefully set. The heavy, polished silver felt out of place in their hands. They held the forks and knives with an unconscious ease, objects of function and not of sentiment. The roast, which had filled the house with a warm, savory aroma, was served onto the fine china plates. I watched them eat. They ate quickly, efficiently, as if fueling up for their next engagement. The conversation skimmed across the surface of things. Robert spoke of the stock market, of interest rates, of a new wing being added to their house. Anne described a recent charity gala, detailing the gowns and the guest list. They spoke a language of acquisitions and achievements, a dialect in which I was not fluent. I sat mostly in silence, nodding, offering a small smile when one was expected. I was the host, the patriarch, yet I felt like an invisible spectator at my own table, a ghost at the feast. The food I had cooked with such care, channeling memories of Eleanor with every pinch of rosemary, was consumed without comment, a pleasant but forgettable part of the day's itinerary. Then the conversation turned fully to Robert. He had recently closed a significant deal, and he began to recount the story with the satisfaction of a general describing a victorious battle. He leaned back in his chair, his gestures becoming broader, his voice taking on a richer, more performative tone. He detailed the long hours, the complex negotiations, the risks he had taken. He praised his team. He credited a mentor from his university days. He even gave a nod to Anne for her patience with his late nights at the office. I listened, my hands resting on the table, my knuckles white. Each milestone in his story was a ghost I knew intimately. The down payment for the condo that gave him a foothold in the city. I remembered selling a prized set of antique planes to fund it. The tuition for the business seminar that got him noticed by his first major employer. I remembered the ache in my back from a month of weekend cabinet jobs I took on to pay for it. He built his narrative brick by brick, a monument to his own perseverance, his own genius, and as he spoke, he was unknowingly paving over the foundations I had laid for him in secret. The climax of his story arrived. He paused, taking a sip of water, and looked around the room, at the faded wallpaper, at the sturdy but unfashionable furniture, at me. His expression was not unkind. It was something far worse, a sort of fond, compassionate pity. It was the look one gives to a simple, well-meaning creature who cannot possibly understand the complexities of the modern world. And then he said it. He did not shout it. He did not level it as an accusation. He stated it as a simple, unassailable fact, an obvious truth that needed to be acknowledged before the story of his triumph could be complete. He made it clear that he had climbed the mountain of his success all on his own, with no ropes, no safety net. And then his eyes met mine directly across the table, and he delivered the final, cutting blow. "You, Dad," he said, the words gentle but their weight immense. "You never helped me." The sentence hung in the air, absolute and devastating. It was not an attack. It was a verdict. It was the erasure of a lifetime. For a moment, all sound in the room seemed to cease. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, the hum of the refrigerator, the chirping of birds outside the window. All of it was swallowed by a deafening silence. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold, prickling sensation that started in my scalp and washed down my entire body. The heavy silver fork in my hand suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The bite of roast beef in my mouth turned to tasteless, pulpy fiber. I could feel Anne's nervous glance, could see from the corner of my eye the grandchildren finally looking up from their screens, their young faces blank, but sensing the sudden seismic shift in the room's emotional landscape. My own history, my secret ledger of sacrifice, flashed through my mind. The sleepless nights, the sold tools, the foregone comforts, the quiet, constant, invisible river of support that had flowed from my workshop to his gleaming life. All of it, in a single casually delivered sentence, had been damned, diverted, and denied. It had never existed. I lowered my gaze to my own hands, resting on the white linen napkin. I studied the scars, the calluses, the swollen joints. Then I looked up, directly at my son, the successful man he had become. I felt the muscles around my mouth pull themselves into a shape that was not a genuine expression of feeling, but a carefully constructed mask. I smiled. It was a small, tight, empty smile. And I gave a slight nod, a gesture of concession. I conceded the point, the argument, the reality he had created for himself. In that moment of profound humiliation, I chose the quiet armor of silence, the only defense I had left. The sound of their car engine dwindled, a fading hum that was slowly absorbed by the immense quiet of the surrounding woods. When it was gone completely, the silence that rushed back in to fill the void was different from the one I had woken up to. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with the residue of their visit. The air, still holding the ghost of Anne's perfume, felt foreign and wrong. I stood motionless in the living room, a statue in the wreckage of a battlefield. My gaze fell upon the dining table. It was a scene of hasty departure. A crumpled linen napkin lay beside a half-eaten slice of roast. Anne's wine glass bore a perfect, waxy crescent of her lipstick on its rim. Crumbs littered the polished wood. The beautiful, orderly stage I had set had been unceremoniously abandoned, a testament to a performance that had ended disastrously. I felt a profound disconnect from the space, as if I were looking at a stranger's house. The urge to clean, to restore order, was entirely absent. Instead, a powerful need to escape, to retreat from this contaminated space, rose within me. I turned my back on the mess, on the lingering presence of my family, and walked toward the basement door. The cool brass knob felt solid and real in my hand, an anchor in the swirling sea of my emotions. I opened the door and was greeted by the familiar scent of cool, damp earth and aging wood. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight, a weary but welcoming sound. Each step down was a step away from the man who had smiled and nodded at the dining table, and a step closer to the man I actually was. With every footfall, the oppressive quiet of the house above was replaced by a different kind of silence below. This was a working silence, a silence filled with the latent energy of creation. When my feet touched the cold concrete floor of my workshop, I felt as if I had finally come home. I took a deep, deliberate breath. The air here was a complex perfume of my own making, a layered history of my life's work. The sharp, spicy scent of cedar shavings mingled with the vanilla notes of sanded oak and the clean, resinous perfume of pine. Underneath it all was the metallic tang of machine oil, the earthy aroma of the concrete floor, and the faint, sweet smell of linseed oil from my finishing rags. This was my sanctuary. I did not turn on the main overhead lights, preferring the intimate pool of light cast by the single, low-hanging bulb above my workbench. Its yellow glow softened the hard edges of the room, turning the space into a cavern of shadows and secrets. My tools hung in their designated places on the vast pegboard walls, a silent army awaiting my command. There were the handsaws, their teeth sharp and glinting, a family of chisels arranged by size, their polished rosewood handles worn smooth by my grip, the heavy cast iron planes that had belonged to my father. Each tool was an extension of my own hands, a repository of skill and memory. A fine pale dust of countless projects coated every surface, a soft, homogeneous layer that muted the colors of the world and captured the light, like a winter frost. I walked over to my main workbench, the heart of this subterranean kingdom. Its surface, a thick slab of maple, was a map of my past, scarred with cuts, peppered with drill holes, and stained with rings of glue and varnish. I ran my hand over its surface, feeling the familiar geography of its imperfections. This bench had never judged me. It had borne the weight of my frustrations and witnessed the quiet joy of my small triumphs. It had always been an honest partner. I sank onto the worn wooden stool, its legs uneven from decades of use, and let the full weight of the afternoon crash down upon me. In the protective embrace of my workshop, the mask I had worn upstairs finally crumbled. The words, his words, echoed in the quiet space, no longer just a memory, but a living presence in the room. "You never helped me." The phrase circled in my mind, each repetition stripping away another layer of my composure. It was a clean cut, a wound inflicted with surgical precision, straight through the heart of my identity as a father. I felt a hot surge of anger, followed by a wave of sorrow so profound it felt like I was drowning. For years, I had accepted his distance, his casual disregard for my world. I had told myself it was the natural way of things. The son grows up, builds his own life, and the father recedes into the background. I had believed that my actions, the quiet, steady provision of support, would speak for themselves. I had been a fool. My actions had not spoken. They had been silent. And silence, I now understood with chilling clarity, could be interpreted as absence. It could be edited out of the story altogether. I thought of Eleanor. I could almost see her standing in the doorway of the workshop late at night, a cup of tea in her hands, her face etched with worry as she watched me work on yet another side job. She never questioned why I pushed myself so hard. She knew. She saw the sacrifices. She was the sole keeper of that truth alongside me, and with her gone, that truth now lived only in me, a story with no audience. It was the thought of her, of our shared, unspoken pact, that finally broke the dam of my passivity. I could not let his version of the story be the final one. I owed it to her. I owed it to the man I had been for the last 50 years. This was not about vengeance. It was about restoring a truth that had been carelessly obliterated. With a newfound cold resolve, I stood up. My movements were slow, but purposeful. I walked to the far corner of the workshop, a space cluttered with stacks of leftover lumber and old, dried-out cans of varnish. I moved a heavy stack of birch plywood, the muscles in my back complaining. Behind it, covered by a dusty canvas tarp, was a small gray metal lockbox, rusted at the hinges. I lifted it and carried it back to the workbench, setting it down in the center of the warm pool of light. The key was on the same ring as the key to my truck, a small, simple skeleton key. It turned in the lock with a rusty shriek of protest. I lifted the lid. The air that escaped smelled of old paper and enclosed time. Inside, beneath a bundle of old tax returns and a few faded photographs, was a simple cloth-bound ledger. Its cover was a deep navy blue, now faded to the color of a twilight sky. There was no label on the front. It was completely anonymous. I lifted it out. The cover felt soft and frayed at the edges. The cardboard beneath weakened from years of being handled. I laid it on the clean surface of the workbench, and with a hand that was surprisingly steady, I opened it to the first page. The paper was yellowed, the blue lines faded, but my handwriting was still clear, written in the precise, slightly slanted script I had learned in drafting class decades ago. The ink had turned from black to a soft, sepulchral gray. The first entry was dated October 12, 1998. It read, $150 textbooks, economics and philosophy, for Robert. A memory, sharp and vivid, bloomed in my mind. I saw Robert, 18 years old, standing in this very workshop, showing me the list from the university bookstore, his face a mixture of excitement and anxiety over the cost. I remembered the feel of the three $50 bills I had pressed into his hand, money I had set aside for a new table saw. I turned the page. March 4th, 1999, $400. Repair to transmission, 1992 Ford Escort. The memory of the panicked late-night phone call, of Robert stranded on the highway miles from home, was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. The money had come from a set of custom bookshelves I had stayed up 2 nights straight to finish for a wealthy client. I closed my eyes for a moment. The ledger opened before me. The pain of my son's words was still there, a raw, open wound. But now, it was mixed with something else. It was the feeling of holding something solid, something real. This was not just a notebook. It was the anchor of my memory. It was the tangible, irrefutable proof of a life that had been lived, a love that had been given. And in the deep, resonant silence of my workshop, I knew what I had to do. The house above me had fallen into a deep, impenetrable silence. Night had fully descended, pressing against the small high windows of the workshop, turning them into squares of black glass that reflected the solitary bulb glowing above my head. The world outside had ceased to exist. My universe had contracted to the circumference of this yellow light, to the scarred surface of my workbench, and to the blue cloth-bound ledger that lay open before me. Time itself seemed to have stopped, holding its breath as I prepared to excavate my own past. My hands, which could still shape a piece of stubborn oak with confidence, felt clumsy and slow as I turned the first few pages. The brittle paper whispered in the quiet, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. The initial entries were a chronicle of small paternal duties, the mundane transactions of a father supporting a son away at college for the first time. $100 for a new winter coat, $75 for a train ticket home for Thanksgiving, $200 for a replacement laptop when his old one died during midterms. Each line item, written in my neat, measured script, was a ghost. I remembered the phone call about the laptop, the genuine panic in Robert's voice. I had taken on a weekend job refinishing a neighbor's set of antique dining chairs, a tedious, painstaking task that filled my lungs with the dust of old varnish and left my shoulders aching for days. but I remembered the relief in Robert's voice when I gave him the cash, a feeling that had been worth more than any physical discomfort. I continued to turn the pages, the years passing in a soft rustle of paper. Then I came to an entry that made me pause, my finger tracing the faded gray ink. May 12th, 2001. $2,500. Down payment, $19.99 Toyota Corolla. The memory attached to this number was not a ghost. It was a fully formed presence in the room. Robert had secured a prestigious summer internship at a firm in Boston, a stepping stone that was crucial for his career path. But it was unpaid, and the office was miles from his student apartment. He needed a car. He had found a reliable used sedan, but he didn't have the down payment. I remembered him explaining the situation to me, his face alight with ambition and shadowed by the frustrating practical barrier of money. At the time, my own savings were thin. I was in the middle of a slow season, with only a few small jobs lined up. But I had an asset, a treasure I kept locked in a felt-lined wooden case. It was a set of rare hand-forged Japanese chisels, a gift from an old master craftsman I had apprenticed under as a young man. Their laminated steel blades could hold an edge like no other, and their red oak handles felt like they were extensions of my own hands. They were my pride, a symbol of my dedication to the craft. I sold them to a collector in Vermont. I remembered the hollowness I felt as I packed them away, the quiet finality of it. 2 days later, I placed 25 $100 bills in an envelope and gave it to Robert. He had been ecstatic, his gratitude effusive and sincere. He promised to pay me back as soon as he was on his feet. I had smiled, telling him not to worry, feeling the phantom weight of the chisels in my hands. My finger moved down the page, and the sense of coldness in the pit of my stomach intensified. I knew what was coming next. There, on a page by itself, as if requiring its own space to bear its weight, was a single entry. September 20th, 2004. $15,000. Final repayment of outstanding federal student loan. This was not a memory of a tool sold or a weekend of lost sleep. This was the memory of a choice made in the shadow of death. Eleanor had been diagnosed 8 months prior. The doctors had been gentle but direct, their words cloaked in the soft language of probabilities and limited options. There was, however, a new experimental treatment available at a private clinic, a sliver of hope that was not covered by our modest insurance plan. For months, we had been quietly putting every spare dollar into a separate savings account, a hope fund, as Eleanor called it. It was our secret weapon in a war we were slowly losing. Around that same time, Robert was graduating. He had done brilliantly, securing a promising job offer at a financial firm, but he was shackled by the immense weight of his student debt, a liability that would cripple his ability to secure credit, to invest, to begin the life he had worked so hard to build. He never asked for the money directly, but the stress was evident in every conversation. He spoke of his future as a race he was starting with a lead weight chained to his ankle. I remember the night Eleanor and I made the decision. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the balance of the Hope Fund written on a slip of paper between us. I couldn't bring myself to suggest it. It was she who had reached across the table and placed her warm, frail hand on mine. She hadn't needed to say a word. Her eyes, clear and unwavering, told me everything. Our time was uncertain, a dwindling resource. His time was just beginning. Her silent sacrifice was a command. The next day, I went to the bank, withdrew the entire sum, and wrote the check that would unshackle my son, while knowingly tightening the chains around our own dwindling future. It was an act of love, but it felt like a betrayal, a terrible, necessary choice between two futures. I slowly pushed past that page, my throat tight. The character of the ledger began to change. The entries became more frequent, the numbers larger. The pretense of them being temporary loans faded away, leaving only a stark record of need and provision. There was $5,000 for a wedding photographer Robert insisted was the best. There was $20,000 scraped together from the sale of a small parcel of land I had inherited from my father, to help with the down payment on their first house, a house I had only been invited to 3 times. Page after page, the story unfolded. Money for private preschool for Lily. A loan to cover a minor investment loss Robert had suffered. Funds to help them buy a second car when Anne decided she needed an SUV. Each transaction was a quiet erosion of my own security, a chipping away at the small foundation I had built for my own old age. Each one was a dream deferred, the new workshop I had wanted to build, the trip to see the giant sequoias Eleanor had always dreamed of, the simple peace of mind of having a cushion against the unknown. I had traded it all, piece by piece, for the polished, seamless success of my son's life. He had built his shining castle on a hill, never knowing that the stones had been quarried from the bedrock of my own small mountain. Finally, I reached the last entry, dated just over a year ago. It was for a modest sum to fix a leaky roof on their vacation home. I read the words, and then I slowly closed the blue cover of the ledger. I did not feel the hot, explosive rage I had anticipated. Instead, a profound and heavy calm settled over me. The shock and humiliation I had felt at the dinner table had been a raw, shapeless pain. But now, that pain had been given a name, a date, a number. It had been quantified and catalogued. It was real. It was a history, meticulously documented in my own hand. My son hadn't just insulted me. He had unknowingly tried to burn down the library of my life. But he had failed, because I was still sitting here, and I was holding the last surviving copy. My hand rested on the worn cloth cover, feeling the solid weight of the book. It was no longer just a record of debts. It was a testament, and in the deep, listening silence of my workshop, I knew that the time for silence was over. The story deserved to be read. For a long time, I did not move. I remained on the stool in my workshop, the closed ledger lying on the bench before me like a sealed indictment. The cold resolve that had crystallized within me upon reviewing its pages began to thaw, its sharp edges softening into a murky, chilling pool of doubt. The initial righteous anger had been a fire, warming me against the shock of my son's words. But as the hours crept by in the subterranean quiet, that fire died down to embers, and a damp, creeping cold began to seep into my bones. It was the cold of consequence. The ledger was no longer a shield of truth. It felt like a weapon, heavy and dangerous in its potential for destruction. And I, a man who had only ever used his hands to build, was now contemplating an act of demolition. I began to question the very foundation of my new purpose. Was this truly a quest for truth? Or was it a carefully disguised, more palatable form of revenge? A desire to inflict a wound as deep as the one that had been inflicted upon me. The thought was nauseating. I imagined the scene, playing it over and over in my mind, a tormenting loop of possibilities, each one worse than the last. In one version, I saw myself presenting the ledger to Robert. I saw his face shift from curiosity to disbelief, then to a dark, defensive anger. I could almost hear the words he would use, the sharp, cutting arguments of a man skilled in twisting narratives to his advantage. He would accuse me of keeping score, of tallying up a father's love as if it were a common debt. He would call me petty, a bitter old man holding on to ancient history. He would reframe my sacrifices as acts of control, a way of indebting him to me forever. In this imagined future, my truth would be twisted into a weapon against me, and I would be left not vindicated, but exposed and shamed, the villain of a story I had intended to correct. The very act of revealing the truth would become the ultimate lie. The thought made my hands tremble. Then another, perhaps more terrifying scenario unfolded in my mind. I saw him take the ledger, flip through the pages with a detached, almost bored expression. His world was one of deals worth millions, of assets and portfolios that I could barely comprehend. What were these figures from a bygone era to him now? A few thousand here, a few thousand there. The cost of a single business dinner, perhaps. I pictured him closing the book with a soft thud, a slight patronizing smile on his face. He might even thank me, a casual, dismissive gesture before changing the subject to the weather or his next vacation. In this version, my grand revelation, the sum of my life's hidden work, would not even register as significant. It would be a footnote in the epic of his success, a minor accounting discrepancy from a past he had long since outgrown. The humiliation of that would be 1,000 times worse than his anger. It would be a final confirmation of my own insignificance. But the deepest fear, the one that coiled in my gut like a cold serpent, was the vision of finality. I saw the confrontation ending not in anger or dismissal, but in a quiet, permanent severing of our bond. I saw him looking at me with the eyes of a stranger, his face a mask of disappointment and hurt. I saw him walk out the door of my house for the last time. I saw the future stretching out before me, an endless expanse of silent holidays, unanswered phone calls, and the slow fading of my grandchildren's faces from my memory. The price of setting the record straight would be the utter annihilation of my family. I would win the argument, but lose my son. I would be left alone in this quiet house, clinging to a victory that tasted of ash, my righteousness a cold comfort in an empty room. Was any truth worth that? Was it better to live with a palatable lie than to die in a state of desolate, absolute honesty? The weight of that question was immense, and I felt myself buckling beneath it. I stood up from the stool and looked at the old cast-iron stove in the corner of the workshop, where I sometimes burned wood scraps on the coldest winter days. The temptation to take the ledger, to thrust it into the stove's dark mouth and reduce it to a handful of gray, meaningless ash, was overwhelming. To burn the evidence would be to restore the fragile piece, to accept the wound and allow it to scar over, however imperfectly. I could not bring myself to do it. Torn and exhausted, I turned my back on the ledger and the workshop that had become my interrogation chamber. I needed air, a different perspective. I climbed the stairs, my legs feeling heavy and weak. The house upstairs was dark and cold. The mess on the dining table was still there, a monument to my pain. I walked past it, into the living room. Moonlight filtered through the windows, painting the furniture in pale, ghostly strokes. My eyes were drawn to the mantelpiece, to the collection of photographs that traced the timeline of our family. And they settled on one in particular. It was a silver-framed picture of Eleanor, taken on a trip we had made to the coast 20 years ago. It wasn't a posed shot. I had caught her unaware as she looked out at the ocean. The wind was whipping a few strands of hair across her face, and she was squinting slightly against the bright sun, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. It was a picture not just of her face, but of her essence, strong, honest, and utterly without pretense. Looking at her, a specific memory surfaced, pushing aside the fog of my doubts. It was from years ago, when a wealthy client, for whom I had built an intricate hand-carved library, had tried to shortchange me on the final payment, claiming the work was not quite what he had envisioned. I had been devastated, not just by the loss of money, but by the casual dismissal of my weeks of meticulous labor. I had been ready to accept the reduced payment, just to avoid a confrontation. I hated conflict. That evening, I had told Eleanor about it, my voice full of defeat. She had listened patiently, her hands busy mending one of Robert's torn shirts. When I was finished, she did not offer advice or tell me what to do. She simply put down her sewing, looked me straight in the eye, and placed her hand on my arm. It was a simple gesture, but it was filled with a powerful, unwavering belief. Her look did not say, "Fight for the money." It said, "Fight for the work." It said, "Your labor has value, your skill has honor, and you will not allow anyone to diminish it." The next day, armed with her silent strength, I had gone back to the client and calmly, firmly demanded what I was owed. And I had received it. Staring at her smiling face in the moonlight, I realized this was the same situation, only the stakes were infinitely higher. The work in question was not a set of bookshelves. It was the entire architecture of my life as a father. Robert's words had not just devalued my contribution, they had devalued hers, too. Every sacrifice I had made, she had made alongside me, in her own quiet way. She had managed the household on a tighter budget. She had mended old clothes instead of buying new ones. She had offered me her unwavering support when I was exhausted and discouraged. The ledger was our story, not just mine. To burn it would be to betray her memory. To remain silent would be to dishonor the silent, powerful partnership that had been the bedrock of my entire life. My motivation shifted, purified by her memory. This was no longer about my wounded pride. It was not about punishing my son. It was about honoring the truth of a life we had built together. It was a duty I owed to her, to the woman who had always believed in the value of honest work. The fear of the consequences did not vanish, but it shrank, reassigned to a secondary importance. I reached out and touched the cool glass of the photograph. I then turned and walked back toward the basement door, my steps now steady, my purpose clear. I descended once more into my sanctuary. The blue ledger still lay on the workbench. It was not a weapon. It was not a bomb. It was a testament, and I was its keeper. The first light of dawn found me still in the workshop, the blue ledger sitting on the bench like a stone in the center of my world. My resolve, forged in the moonlight by the memory of Eleanor's face, was firm. I would not burn the book. I would not let the truth die with me. But as I stared at the ledger's frayed, unassuming cover, a new and profound dissatisfaction began to take root. The object itself felt crude, insufficient for the task I was now assigning it. To simply hand this book to Robert, to thrust this stark, cold accounting of my life into his hands, felt like a brute force attack. It was an act of confrontation, not communication. It was a list of grievances, a bill for services rendered. It was an accusation, and an accusation I knew would only be met with defense, with anger, with the closing of a door that might already be almost shut. I had spent a lifetime speaking a language that Robert had never bothered to learn, the language of the hands, of the grain, of the patient shaping of raw material into something of purpose and quiet beauty. I had built his first crib, his childhood desk, the bookshelves that held his university texts. My love for him was in the tight dovetail joints, the hand-sanded finishes, the silent, sturdy presence of the things I had made. He had lived his life surrounded by my vocabulary, but he had never learned to read it. Now, for this final and most important message, I could not abandon my native tongue. The truth needed a vessel. It needed a form that could speak of the care, the patience, and the silent labor that the numbers in the ledger only hinted at. The message had to be delivered not as an attack, but as a final, perfect piece of my life's work. My gaze lifted from the ledger and began to roam the familiar landscape of my workshop. I saw the stacks of lumber, neatly arranged by species, that lined the far wall. They were a library of possibilities, a collection of stories waiting to be told. I stood up and walked over to them, my hand trailing along the rough edges of the boards. I considered the oak, my most trusted and familiar material. It was strong, honest, and reliable. But it was too plain, too utilitarian. The message it would send was one of simple, dutiful strength, and this story was more complex than that. I ran my fingers over a plank of dark American walnut, its grain rich and deep like fertile soil. It was beautiful, but it felt too somber, too funereal. This was not meant to be a memorial to a dead relationship, but a chance, however slim, at a resurrection of understanding. I needed a material that spoke not of sorrow, but of a truth that was intricate and, in its own way, beautiful. My search led me to a corner of the workshop I rarely visited, where I kept the special pieces, the boards I was saving for a project that was worthy of them. And there, leaning against the damp stone wall, was the one. It was a single, wide plank of bird's eye maple I had bought from a traveling lumber salesman more than 20 years ago. I had paid a small fortune for it, recognizing its rare quality, and I had been waiting for the right moment to use it ever since. I pulled the heavy plank from the shadows and carried it to the workbench, laying it down beside the ledger. Even covered in a fine layer of dust, its potential was breathtaking. I wiped it down with a soft rag, and the wood's secret came to life. The surface was not a simple, straight grain. It was a constellation of small, swirling patterns, tiny knots that looked like the eyes of a bird. Hundreds of them. They shimmered in the light, giving the wood a depth and a life that was almost magical. The symbolism was so powerful, so immediate, that it struck me with the force of a physical blow. These were the eyes that had seen everything. These were the countless, unacknowledged moments of sacrifice, the silent hours of labor, the hidden anxieties, and the quiet acts of love. The wood itself was a witness. Its beauty was not overt or flashy. It was subtle, complex, and required a close, patient look to be fully appreciated. It was the perfect metaphor for the story I needed to tell. The plan began to form in my mind, not as a vague idea, but as a complete and detailed blueprint. I would build a box, a simple, perfectly proportioned box to hold this ledger. It would be my final gift to my son, and my final statement. I took out a pad of graph paper and a sharpened pencil. My hands, which had felt so uncertain just an hour before, were now steady and sure. I began to sketch. The design would be clean, almost severe in its simplicity. There would be no ornate carvings, no decorative moldings. The wood itself was the decoration. Anything else would be a distraction. The power of the piece would reside entirely in its craftsmanship. The corners would be joined with hand-cut dovetails, not the quick, machine-made kind, but the delicate, precise pins and tails that interlock with a satisfying, permanent strength. The dovetail joint is an honest one. It displays its own construction. Its strength is visible. It is a joint that, once assembled, is almost impossible to pull apart. It speaks of connection, of an interlocking dependence. It was the right choice. I decided there would be no metal, no hinges, no lock, no nails or screws. The box would be an object of pure woodworking, a testament to the craft. The lid would not be hinged, but would be a piston-fit design, crafted to slide perfectly into place with just the slightest whisper of air pressure. This would require a level of precision that bordered on the obsessive, a tolerance measured in fractions of a millimeter. The act of opening the box would have to be slow and deliberate. The lid could not be casually flipped open. It would demand a moment of intention from the person opening it. Finally, I considered the interior. The ledger could not simply rest against the bare wood. It needed to be presented with a sense of solemnity. I envisioned a lining of deep navy blue velvet, the same color as the ledger's cover. The book would rest on this soft, dark field, cradled and protected, presented not as a piece of evidence in a trial, but as a sacred text, an object of immense and private value. I spent the next hour refining the sketch, calculating the dimensions, making a list of the tools I would need. The emotional chaos that had been churning inside me was being channeled, transformed into a logical sequence of steps, into an orderly and precise plan. The act of planning was itself a form of healing. I was no longer a passive victim of my son's careless words. I was a craftsman, a maker, a man with a purpose. I was taking the shapeless, agonizing mess of my past, and I was going to build a beautiful, honest container for it. I stood back from the workbench and looked at the drawing, at the plank of bird's eye maple, and at the old blue ledger. They were the three elements of my story: the plan, the material, and the truth. The workshop was quiet, but it was no longer a silence of despair. It was the focused, anticipatory silence that always precedes the first cut. The days that followed ceased to be measured by the rising and setting of the sun. My world contracted to the steady, yellow glow of the lamp above my workbench, and time was kept, not by the ticking of a clock, but by the rhythmic strokes of a hand plane and the soft whisper of a fine-toothed saw. I became a creature of this subterranean world, surfacing only for brief, mechanical necessities. A few hours of dreamless sleep, a simple meal eaten standing in the kitchen, a cup of bitter coffee that I would carry back down into my sanctuary. The work absorbed me completely. It was a demanding and jealous master, requiring the full measure of my attention, and I gave it willingly. For in this total immersion, in this disciplined focus on the task at hand, I found a respite from the churning chaos of my own mind. The pain of my son's words had not vanished, but it was transformed. It was no longer a wild, untamed beast tearing at me from the inside. It had become a fuel, a source of focused energy that I could pour into the wood through the conduit of my hands. The process began with the marking of the first cut. I laid the plank of bird's eye maple on the bench, its constellation of tiny eyes seeming to watch me with a patient, ancient wisdom. I measured not twice, but 3 times, my pencil making a barely visible tick mark. Then I took my marking knife, its steel edge honed to a surgical sharpness, and guided by a heavy steel square, I scribed a deep, clean line across the grain. This was the point of no return. The moment the blade severed the first fibers of the wood, the plank ceased to be a piece of raw material and began its journey to becoming the box. I picked up my Japanese pull saw, its thin, flexible blade designed for precision. The first stroke was tentative, a delicate whisper. Then, finding the groove of the scribed line, the saw settled into its work, cutting on the pull stroke with a steady, rhythmic shh that was the only sound in the workshop. The scent that rose from the cut was clean and sweet, with a faint hint of vanilla and spice. It was the smell of the maple's hidden life, released into the air by the violating, yet creative, act of the saw. With the main sections cut, the laborious process of dimensioning the lumber began. Each of the 4 sides of the box had to be perfectly flat, perfectly square, and of a precisely uniform thickness. I worked by hand, forgoing my loud and aggressive power tools for the quiet intimacy of the hand plane. I clamped the first piece into my vise and selected my longest jointer plane, its cast iron body heavy and cool in my hands. The work was a physical meditation, a dance of body and tool I had practiced for over 50 years. The forward push from the legs and shoulders, the steady pressure, the slight lift at the end of the stroke. With each pass, the plane lifted a translucent, gossamer thin shaving of maple that curled and fell to the floor. The sound was a soft, satisfying shing, the voice of a sharp blade moving through willing wood. I worked until the surface was as flat and true as a sheet of glass, checking my progress constantly with a steel straightedge, searching for the slightest deviation, the smallest sliver of light that would betray an imperfection. It was repetitive, demanding work, and beads of sweat soon traced paths through the fine sawdust on my brow. But in this rhythm, my mind grew still. The endless loop of resentment and doubt was silenced, replaced by a singular focus on the task: flat, straight, square. As I worked, my mind did not remain entirely blank. The meditative state did not erase my past, but it allowed memories to surface gently, without the sharp, painful edges they had possessed before. While I was carefully laying out the lines for the dovetail joints, the most critical phase of the construction, I was suddenly visited by a memory of Robert as a boy of 10. He was in this workshop, standing on a small stool, his face a mask of concentration as he tried to guide a handsaw along a line I had drawn for him on a piece of soft pine. I remembered his frustration at his own inability to keep the cut straight, his impatience, his desire to just use a hammer and nails because it was faster. I remembered my own patient insistence on teaching him the right way, on showing him that the strength and beauty of a thing lay in the care with which it was joined together. He had learned the lesson for an afternoon, completing a small wobbly bookshelf that he was immensely proud of, but he had never truly understood the philosophy behind it. He had grown into a man who always sought the fastest, most efficient path, the world of the nail gun and the quick fix, a world where the slow, difficult, and invisible work of building a strong joint had no value. The memory was not painful. It was simply sad, a quiet acknowledgement of a fundamental difference that had been present in our natures from the very beginning. The cutting of the dovetails required my absolute, undivided attention. With a sharp pencil and a precision square, I marked the pins on one board and the tails on the other, the geometry precise and unforgiving. Then, with my finest dovetail saw, I began to cut. This was not the work of strength, but of finesse. My breathing became slow and even, my hands steady. I was not cutting to the line, but beside it, leaving the graphite itself as a witness to my accuracy. The delicate work of removing the waste material between the pins and tails I did with a set of razor-sharp chisels and a wooden mallet. Tap, tap, tap. Each gentle strike was a calculated blow, carving away the unwanted wood to reveal the perfect, interlocking shape beneath. The sharp reports of the mallet were the only sounds, a steady, percussive heartbeat in the quiet workshop. It was here, in this most demanding of tasks, that I felt most centered. There was no room for anger, no space for sorrow. There was only the chisel's edge, the grain of the wood, and the absolute necessity of getting it right. Any lapse in concentration would ruin the piece, and the precious wood, my witness, would be spoiled. After hours that felt like days, the four sides of the box were cut and jointed. The moment came for the first dry assembly. My heart beat a little faster as I took the four pieces from the bench. I aligned the first corner, the precisely cut tails of one board hovering over the pins of the other. I gave it a gentle push. They resisted, the fit intentionally tight. With a small dead-blow mallet and a block of scrap wood to protect the delicate maple, I began to gently persuade the joint together. With each tap, the pieces slid further into place, until with a final, soft thud, they seated themselves perfectly. The joint was seamless, a beautiful visible expression of strength and interdependence. I repeated the process for the other three corners. When I was finished, I stood the assembly on the workbench. It was no longer four separate pieces of wood. It was a single, unified object. A perfect, hollow square of shimmering bird's-eye maple. It had a presence, a life of its own. I ran my hand over the interlocking corners, feeling the flush, seamless transition from one board to the next. A profound, quiet satisfaction washed over me, a feeling of peace that I had not felt in a long, long time. The chaos of my emotions had not been conquered, but it had been harnessed. It had been given form, and in the silent, sawdust-scented air of my workshop, I looked at what I had made and felt, for the first time in weeks, a sense of hope. I was in the process of fitting the lid, the most delicate and nerve-wracking stage of the box's construction. The four sides, perfectly joined, stood on the bench before me, a testament to the focused calm I had cultivated over the past several days. My world had become a universe of microns and whispers. I would take a single paper-thin shaving off the edge of the lid with a finely set block plane, its blade so sharp it hummed. Then, I would test the fit. It was a conversation between my hands and the wood, a slow, patient dialogue where the goal was a perfect, seamless union. The air was still and thick with the sweet, powdery scent of sanded maple. My breathing was even. My mind was empty of everything but the task. I was so completely immersed in this tangible, quiet reality that when the telephone began to ring upstairs, the sound was a physical shock, a violent, electronic shriek that ripped through the fabric of my concentration. It was a sound from a different planet. For 3 full rings, I remained perfectly still, the block plane frozen in my hand, hoping it would stop. It was an unwelcome emissary from the world of noise and demands, the world I had so effectively shut out. But it persisted, its shrill, insistent summons echoing down the basement stairs, a sound that would not be ignored. With a sigh of profound reluctance, I set the plane down, carefully, on a clean rag. The spell was broken. I wiped my hands on my dusty canvas apron, a gesture I knew was futile, as the fine pale dust was embedded in the lines of my skin, a part of me now. Ascending the stairs was like rising from a great depth, a diver returning to a surface world whose atmosphere was thin and hostile. With each step, the comforting scent of the workshop receded, replaced by the neutral, stale air of the main house. As I reached the top of the stairs, I glanced back. The box sat in the warm pool of light from the single bulb, a small glowing beacon of purpose. It was my anchor, the physical manifestation of the truth I was trying to serve. The thought gave me the strength to walk into the kitchen and pick up the receiver. The plastic felt cold and alien against my ear, a stark contrast to the living warmth of the wood I had been holding moments before. The voice on the other end was Robert's. It was exactly as I had known it would be, cheerful, confident, and moving at a pace that seemed to generate its own wind. It was the voice of a man who did not have time for doubt, a man whose world was a series of objectives to be met and obstacles to be overcome. He was completely, utterly oblivious. There was no trace of the tension from our last meeting in his tone, no acknowledgement of the chasm his words had opened between us. For him, that afternoon had clearly been a minor, forgettable event, already archived and dismissed. He launched into a monologue about his work, his voice buzzing with the energy of a recent victory. He spoke of markets, of portfolios, of a competitor's misstep that his company had capitalized on. The words were a torrent of abstractions, a language of percentages and projections that had no weight, no texture, no physical reality. As he spoke of millions of dollars being moved with the click of a button, my eyes wandered around my own small, quiet kitchen. I saw the crack in the linoleum near the stove, the faded pattern of the curtains Eleanor had sewn, the way the afternoon light fell across the simple pine table I had built for our first anniversary. My world was a world of things that could be touched, things that wore their history on their surfaces. While he spoke of his abstract empire of numbers, I could feel the phantom sensation of the plane in my hand, the satisfying friction of a sharp blade against hardwood. I could feel the fine sawdust still coating my arms and the deep, settled ache in my lower back from hours spent hunched over my work. We were not just in different places. We were living in different realities. Then, after a lengthy, breathless account of his latest triumph, the tone of his voice shifted. It became lighter, more casual, the sound of a man transitioning from important business to a minor domestic matter. He mentioned that he and Anne were exhausted, that they had decided on the spur of the moment to fly to the Caribbean for a long weekend. He painted a quick, vivid picture of white sand and blue water, a world of effortless relaxation that was as foreign to me as the surface of the moon. And then, with the thoughtless ease of a man accustomed to having his needs met, he made his request. He asked if I would mind driving over to his house a few times a day, to look after their new puppy and water Anne's collection of orchids. It was not a question so much as an assumption. The request was a small thing, a trivial favor in the grand scheme of a life. But in that moment, it felt like a deliberate and exquisitely crafted piece of cruelty. The irony was so immense, so staggering, that it almost took my breath away. He had sat at my table and erased my life's work, my decades of silent, foundational help, and now he was asking me for the most menial, insignificant kind of help, the kind one would ask of an idle neighbor or a hired service. A wave of the old hot anger washed over me, but it was immediately followed by a feeling that was colder and clearer. The request was a perfect, final piece of evidence. It proved that in his mind, I did not exist as a person with a life of my own. I was simply a retired old man, a vacant space on a chessboard, a resource with zero perceived value, available to be moved at his convenience. My time, my purpose, my profound and all-consuming work on the object sitting on my bench downstairs, none of it was real to him. He could not conceive that I might be engaged in something that was, to me, more important than his dog or his wife's flowers. I looked at my hands, at the sawdust ingrained in my knuckles, and I thought of the box. I thought of the hours of planning, the painstaking labor, the emotional and spiritual energy I had poured into every perfect joint. I was in the midst of creating the most important object of my entire life, and my son saw me as an unemployed house-sitter. The vast empty distance between his perception of me and the reality of my existence was no longer a chasm. It was a galaxy. In that moment of cold clarity, my resolve, which had been wavering just days before, became as hard and as dense as granite. The box was not just a project, it was a necessity. It was the only possible reply. I gave my answer. It was a single quiet word of assent. My voice was a stranger to me, a flat, colorless thing that betrayed none of the seismic shifts happening within me. An argument would have been pointless, a waste of breath. Arguing with him would be like trying to describe the color blue to a man born blind. He accepted my agreement with a cheerful, distracted thanks, and after a few more words about flight times and where he would hide the key, he ended the call. I held the receiver in my hand for a long moment after the line went dead, listening to the hum of the dial tone. It was the sound of an empty connection. I carefully placed the receiver back in its cradle. I did not rush. I stood for a moment in the silence of the kitchen, feeling the echo of his alien world fade away. Then I turned deliberately and walked back to the basement door. The interruption was over. I descended the stairs, returning to my own reality, to the honest scent of wood and the truth that was slowly, patiently, taking shape under my hands, my purpose now sharper and more keenly defined than ever before. The box was built. The four sides stood joined in a testament to the strength of a well-made dovetail joint. The lid and bottom were cut and fitted, and the raw construction was complete. But it was still a thing in the white, a body without a soul. It was a well-formed sentence without punctuation or inflection. The most crucial part of the work, the part that would transform it from a mere container into a true vessel, was yet to begin. The finishing process is not an afterthought for a craftsman. It is the final, intimate conversation with the wood. It is an act of revelation, not of concealment. And I approached it with the same reverence I would a sacred rite. The first step was the long, patient journey of sanding. It began not with sandpaper, but with a finely honed cabinet scraper, its blade sharpened to create a subtle burr. I drew the scraper across the surface of the maple, and it lifted shavings so thin they were like wood smoke, curls of fiber that were almost transparent. This leveled the surface, removing any minute unevenness left by the plane, creating a perfectly flat foundation. Only then did I turn to sandpaper. This was not the work of a noisy, aggressive machine, but a slow, tactile process, done entirely by hand, with a small cork block to back the paper. I began with a medium grit, my arm moving with the grain in long, even strokes. The sound was a soft, rhythmic shushing, a counterpoint to the silence of the workshop. With each pass, I was erasing the final, invisible scars of construction, creating a uniform surface, a blank canvas. This first sanding was a kind of purification, a removal of the past to prepare for the future. After an hour of this steady work, I wiped the box down with a cloth and moved to a finer grit. The sound of the sanding softened to a whisper. The dust I was creating was no longer granular, but a fine, silky powder that floated in the lamplight like motes of captured sunshine. The process was meditative. My mind, which had been so turbulent, was now as focused and as smooth as the surface growing under my fingertips. I was not thinking about Robert, or the past, or the uncertain future. I was thinking only of the pressure of my hand, the feel of the wood, the search for that one tiny patch of roughness that might have escaped my notice. I progressed through 4 grades of sandpaper, each one finer than the last, each one removing the almost invisible scratches of its predecessor. The final sanding was done with a paper as fine as parchment, and by this point, I was no longer abrading the wood, but burnishing it. I was polishing the individual wood fibers themselves, closing the pores, creating a surface that felt not like wood, but like cool, polished stone. It had developed its own soft internal luster, a delicate sheen that came from the wood's own structure, not from any artificial coating. I would close my eyes and run my fingertips, the most sensitive of my tools, over every square inch of the box. This was the only way to truly know if the work was done. When my touch could detect no difference between the sanded maple and a piece of smooth, cool glass, I knew I was ready for the next and most transformative step. The choice of finish was never in doubt. I would not entomb this beautiful wood in a thick plastic shell of polyurethane or lacquer. Those finishes sit on the surface, creating a barrier that reflects light, but seals away the true life of the wood. They are a lie, a shiny mask. I wanted a finish that would penetrate, that would become one with the maple, that would nourish it and reveal the full holographic depth of its grain. I wanted an honest finish. I chose a simple traditional mixture of pure linseed oil and beeswax. On a small electric hot plate in the corner of the workshop, I created a makeshift double boiler. Into a small tin, I poured the linseed oil, its color a rich, translucent amber. To this, I added a chunk of raw beeswax, which I sourced from a local beekeeper. It was a solid, opaque gold, and it smelled faintly of honey and meadows. I watched as the wax slowly melted into the warm oil, the two liquids swirling together until they became a single, homogeneous, and fragrant solution. The aroma that filled the workshop was deep and earthy, the scent of history, of tradition, of things made to last. It was the perfume of preservation. I let the mixture cool until it was just warm to the touch. I took a piece of an old, soft cotton t-shirt and folded it into a tight, lint-free pad. Then I carried the small tin over to the workbench. I stood for a long moment, looking at the box. It was pale and quiet, a canvas awaiting its masterstroke. I took a slow, deep breath. This was the moment of revelation. I dipped the pad into the warm, oily wax, and with a steady hand, I touched it to the center of the lid. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. It was like watching a black and white photograph blossom into full, vibrant color. The pale, unassuming maple drank in the oil and came alive. It darkened to a rich, deep honey gold, and the hundreds of tiny eyes in the grain, which had been subtle, ghostly figures, suddenly leaped into a three-dimensional holographic life. They shimmered and shifted as I moved my head, their depths seeming to capture and refract the light. It was a moment of pure magic, the wood finally revealing the full, spectacular secret it had been holding within itself. I worked the oil into the rest of the surface, my hand moving in slow, deliberate circles. I was not painting. I was feeding. I was giving back to the wood some of the life that had been taken from it, and in return, it was giving me all of its beauty. The process took several days. A hand-rubbed oil finish is a lesson in patience. Each day, I would apply a thin coat, working it into the wood until it was warm from the friction of my hand. I would let it sit for an hour, allowing the oil to penetrate as deeply as it would, and then, with a clean, dry cloth, I would meticulously wipe away every trace of excess from the surface. This was the most critical step. Leaving oil on the surface would result in a sticky, dull finish. The true beauty came from the oil that was in the wood, not on it. Between coats, I would simply sit on my stool and watch the box as it cured, observing the subtle ways the light played on its ever-deepening, ever-glowing surface. When the exterior was finally finished, its surface glowing with a deep satin luster that begged to be touched, I turned my attention to the interior. I had purchased a small piece of the finest navy blue velvet. Working with the precision of a watchmaker, I created a template from thin cardboard, ensuring a perfect fit. I then used a surgeon sharp knife to cut the fabric, its blade sinking through the soft pile with a barely audible hiss. I applied a thin, even layer of hide glue to the interior walls of the box and carefully, painstakingly, fitted the velvet pieces into place, smoothing out any hint of a wrinkle with my fingers. The result was a stark, beautiful contrast. The dark, light-absorbing softness of the velvet against the luminous, light-reflecting hardness of the maple. It was a space of quiet reverence. The time had come. I walked over to the corner of the bench where the blue ledger had been sitting all this time, a silent observer to the creation of its own shrine. I picked it up. It felt frail and humble in my hands, its worn cover and yellowed pages a stark contrast to the perfect object I had just completed. I carried it back, opened the lid of the box, and gently placed the ledger inside. It settled onto the soft velvet with a quiet, dignified weight. Then I took the lid. It was so perfectly fitted that it had to be lowered into place squarely, evenly. As it slid down the last fraction of an inch, I felt a soft puff of air escape from the interior. It was the box exhaling, a gentle sigh of completion. The object was finished. It sat on my bench, silent, beautiful, and complete. It contained my skill, my patience, my pain, my memory, and my love. I had poured all of my unspoken words into its creation. My part was done. The box was finished, and I had brought it upstairs from the workshop. The transition from its birthplace to the world above felt like a significant, irreversible step. I had placed it in the center of the cherry wood coffee table in the living room, and its presence immediately transformed the quiet, familiar space. The room was no longer a place of rest. It had become an anteroom to the future, a holding cell for a verdict that had not yet been delivered. The work of my hands was done, and with their idleness, my mind, which had been so helpfully occupied by the disciplined demands of the craft, was now free to roam, and it roamed directly into the territory of fear. Night fell, a slow, heavy curtain of darkness that seemed to snuff out not just the light, but the air itself. The house was utterly still, but it was a loud, humming stillness, the kind that precedes a violent summer thunderstorm. Every familiar sound, the groan of the refrigerator, the settling of the foundation, the whisper of wind in the eaves, seemed amplified, a portent of the coming disruption. I sat in my old armchair, the one whose cushions held the permanent impression of my body, and I simply stared at the box. In the pale light of the moon, filtering through the window, the bird's-eye maple seemed to glow with a cool internal luminescence. It was beautiful, more beautiful than I had even intended. The finish was so deep it looked like liquid gold held in a solid form. It was a perfect object, but its perfection was no longer a source of pride. It was a source of terror. It seemed too powerful, a contained force whose release I could not predict or control. It was Pandora's box, and I, its creator, was now contemplating the wisdom of handing it to another. Once the lid was lifted, once the truth it held was released into the world, nothing could ever be put back as it was. I felt a profound sense of dread, the terrible responsibility of a man who has built a bomb and is now walking it to its destination. My mind, in a final desperate act of self-preservation, began to erect barricades against my own resolve. It did not use arguments of logic or fear of confrontation, but something far more potent: the ghosts of a happier past. The memories came unbidden, sharp and sweet and agonizingly clear. I saw Robert as a boy of 6, a whirlwind of scabby knees and boundless energy, struggling with his first two-wheeled bicycle. I felt the phantom ache in my own back from bending over, one hand on the seat, the other on the handlebars, jogging alongside him down our quiet street. I remembered the exact moment of letting go, the terrifying, exhilarating second when my hand left the seat, and he was, for the first time, pedaling under his own power. I remembered his initial wobbly panic, followed by a whoop of pure, unadulterated joy as he sailed away from me down the sidewalk. My heart had swelled with a fierce, painful pride. It was the fundamental job of a father, I had thought then, to teach your child how to leave you. I had done it well, but the act I was planning for tomorrow felt like the opposite of that release. It was not a letting go, but a pulling back, a forced reckoning with a past he had already pedaled far, far away from. The scene in my mind dissolved, only to be replaced by another. We were on Lake Annabessacook, in my small aluminum fishing boat. Robert was perhaps 12. It was just after dawn, and a thick pearly mist was rising off the water, muffling the world in a soft gray blanket. We were not talking. We did not need to. We sat in a comfortable, companionable silence, sharing a thermos of hot chocolate that Eleanor had insisted we take, our lines trailing in the still, dark water. I remembered the sudden, frantic tug on his line, the way his eyes widened with surprise and excitement. I remembered him reeling in a small, glistening perch, its scales flashing in the emerging sun. The fish was not big enough to keep, but he held it with a reverence that was almost holy before we gently released it back into the depths. The day had not been about catching fish. It had been about the shared silence, the mist, the simple, uncomplicated fact of being a father and a son together in a boat. Now I was preparing to shatter that shared silence forever. I was about to cast a line into the past and reel in a monster of resentment and blame, a catch that could never be thrown back. Was the truth worth the cost of poisoning such pure and simple memories? This procession of ghosts was a form of torture. They were my mind's final desperate attempt to convince me to choose peace, even a fragile, dishonest peace, over the brutal clarity of the truth. The urge to retreat was a physical thing, a pulling in my gut. I stood up from the armchair, the creak of its old springs sounding like a cry of protest. I walked to the coffee table and picked up the box. It felt heavier than its physical weight, dense with the unspoken words and unseen sacrifices it contained. For a moment I held it, my course of action clear. I would take it to the attic. I would bury it in an old trunk, beneath a pile of Eleanor's winter blankets. In a few years, I would forget where I had put it. Robert would never know. The illusion of our family would remain intact. Life would go on, quietly, peacefully. I took a step toward the hallway. The floorboards groaned under my feet. It would be so easy. But I stopped. I stood in the middle of the living room, the beautiful, terrible box in my hands, and I looked at it. I looked at the seamless perfection of the dovetail joints. I saw the shimmering, spectral eyes of the maple, the wood I had chosen as my witness. I felt the silken, honest finish that had taken days of patient labor to achieve. The box itself was an argument. Its very existence was a testament to the value of honest, difficult work, of patience, of a truth that lies just beneath the surface. To hide it away now would be the ultimate act of hypocrisy. It would be a betrayal of the very principles I had poured into its creation. It would be a betrayal of Eleanor, whose quiet strength was the reason I had started this journey. And it would be a final, pathetic betrayal of myself. I could not control how my son would react. I could not dictate the outcome of tomorrow. But I could control this. I could choose not to be a coward. With a slow, weary sense of resignation, I walked back to the coffee table and placed the box back in the center, its placement now feeling as deliberate and final as the setting of a cornerstone. The decision this time was truly made. The fear had not gone away, but it had taken its place alongside my resolve. I did not go to bed that night. I returned to my armchair and settled in for a long vigil. I sat in the darkness, watching over the polished wooden vessel, a silent guardian of the truth it contained, and I waited, with a calm and heavy heart, for the inevitable dawn, and for the storm that it would surely bring. The dawn arrived not with a brilliant burst of color, but as a slow, quiet dilution of the night's deep ink. I had not slept. I had remained in my armchair, a sentinel watching over the small, polished wooden box that held the condensed and unvarnished truth of my life. I was not tired. The long hours of darkness had burned away the last vestiges of my fear and doubt, leaving behind a strange and lucid calm. My body felt light, my senses sharp. I was a ship that had been stripped down for a coming storm, everything not essential thrown overboard. I was ready. I watched the sun's first rays slant across the living room floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. Each particle seemed to hang suspended, caught in a moment of profound anticipation. The house was quieter than I had ever known it to be. At precisely 8 o'clock, I heard it. The sound began as a distant tremor, a low hum that grew steadily into the familiar, aggressive crunch of tires on my gravel driveway. The storm had made landfall. I did not move from my chair. I did not rush to the window. I simply sat, my hands resting on the worn arms of the chair, and I listened as the engine was cut. A car door slammed shut, and heavy, purposeful footsteps approached my front door. Robert came in without knocking, a habit born of a lifetime of casual ownership of this space. He was a whirlwind of preoccupied energy, dressed for travel in a way that managed to look both casual and expensive. He was already on his way out, his mind miles ahead, likely somewhere over the Atlantic. He tossed a set of keys onto the small table in the entryway, the metallic clatter a sharp, jarring sound in the quiet room. He began to recite a list of instructions for the dog: feeding times, veterinarian's number, the specific brand of treats the puppy preferred. His voice was clipped and efficient, the voice of a man delegating a minor task before moving on to more important matters. He did not seem to notice the charged stillness in the room, or the fact that I had not moved from my chair, or the strange, luminous object sitting on the coffee table before me. He finished his instructions, gave a quick, distracted glance at his watch, and turned to leave. That was the moment, the pivot point upon which everything would turn. The casual, easy rhythm of his departure was something I had to consciously, deliberately break. It felt like stepping in front of a speeding train. I rose from the chair. The movement was slow, measured, and it seemed to pull all the sound from the room. Robert paused at the door, his hand on the knob, and looked back at me, a flicker of impatience in his eyes. I did not speak. I walked to the coffee table, and with both hands, I lifted the box. I held it with a reverence that was not feigned. It was the physical embodiment of my life's deepest and most painful truths, and it deserved to be handled with care. I turned and walked toward him, my steps even and unhurried on the worn wooden floor. I stopped a few feet from him and held it out, an offering. He looked from my face to the box and back again, his expression a mixture of confusion and mild annoyance, as if this were an inconveniently timed and utterly baffling birthday gift. He took it from me. I watched his hands, his soft, uncalloused, manicured hands, as they closed around the warm, polished maple that my own scarred and calloused hands had spent a lifetime learning how to shape. For a moment, he just held it, turning it over, his eyes taking in the seamless dovetailed joints and the shimmering, spectral eyes of the wood. A flicker of genuine admiration crossed his face, the appreciation of a man who recognizes quality, even if he does not understand the soul behind it. He tried to lift the lid, but the piston fit resisted his impatient tug. He looked at me, a question in his eyes. I made a small, slow gesture with my own hands, a lifting motion, indicating that it required patience, a straight and even pull. He tried again, more carefully this time. The lid slid upwards with a soft, protracted hiss, the sound of air being displaced, the sound of a seal being broken. The box exhaled its secret. He looked inside, and his brow furrowed in deeper confusion. He saw the dark, plush velvet, and nestled within it, the humble, incongruous object, the old blue cloth-bound ledger. The stark contrast between the magnificent vessel and its mundane contents was a riddle he could not immediately solve. He looked at me again, his expression now bordering on irritation, as if this were some kind of strange, senile joke. I did not react. I simply held his gaze. My part in the conversation, the part that involved action and creation, was over. He reached in and lifted the ledger out. It looked small and insignificant in his hands. He opened it to the first page. He read the neat, faded script. And in that moment, as his eyes scanned the first few lines, I turned away from him. It was a conscious act of will. I would not stand there and watch his face, would not attempt to gauge his reaction, would not give him an audience for his pain or his anger. This was a reckoning that he had to face alone. I walked to the window that looked out onto the backyard, onto the ancient oak tree, whose branches were gnarled like the knuckles of my own hands. I placed my palms flat on the cool windowsill, grounding myself. The entire world seemed to shrink to the space of the room behind me. My own heartbeat was a deafening drum in my ears. I focused on the sounds, the deafening, crushing silence, a silence so total it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. And then, the only sound in the universe, the soft, dry rustle of a page being turned. It was a small sound, but it was as loud and as final as a slamming prison door. A long pause, filled with a silence that was heavier than the one that had preceded it. Then another rustle, another page. I could feel, without seeing, the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The air grew thick, heavy, difficult to breathe. I did not know what was happening on his face, but I could feel the invisible shockwaves of his discovery radiating through the floorboards. I kept my back to him, my eyes fixed on a single trembling leaf on the oak tree outside. The storm had broken. The lightning had struck. And now, I was standing in the blinding, silent flash, waiting for the thunder to finally roll in. I remained at the window, my back to the room, a sentry at the edge of my own life. The world outside, the world of the oak tree and the slow crawl of the morning sun, was a kind of anchor, a fixed point of reality in a room where the very laws of gravity and time seemed to have been suspended. Behind me, the terrible, quiet sacrament of the reading continued. The rustle of each page turning was the only sound, a dry, brittle counterpoint to the frantic, silent beating of my own heart. With every rustle, I felt another layer of a lifetime of burden being lifted from my shoulders and transferred into the air of the room. It was a strange, hollowed-out feeling, a sense of becoming lighter, of being slowly emptied of a weight I had carried for so long, I had forgotten it was even there. I was no longer a participant in this drama. I had delivered the script, and now I was merely a member of the audience, waiting for the final act to unfold. My anger, which had been the fuel for this entire endeavor, had burned itself out, leaving behind not ash, but a clean, cool emptiness. The page turning, which had seemed to go on for an eternity, finally stopped. The cessation of that small sound was more jarring than any shout could have been. It was followed by a silence that was different from the one that had come before. It was not the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of arrival, a silence of finality. I knew, with an instinct that went deeper than hearing, that he had reached the last entry, the last date, the last number. The story was now fully told. I did not turn. I kept my gaze fixed on the yard, on a small patch of clover near the roots of the old oak. I heard a sound behind me, a sharp, quiet intake of air, as if a man who had been underwater for a very long time had just broken the surface. It was followed by the soft, definitive thud of the ledger being closed. A moment later, I heard the weary creak of a kitchen chair, the sound of a body surrendering its weight not to rest, but to the sheer, crushing force of a revelation it could no longer stand to support. Then came the most telling sound of all. It was a long, slow, shuddering exhalation of breath. It was not a sob or a sigh, but the sound of a structure collapsing in on itself, of a lifetime of carefully constructed certainties being deflated, leaving only a hollow space behind. It was the sound of my son, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, being rendered utterly and completely speechless. I remained at the window. I gave him the dignity of this silence, this moment of terrible private unraveling. I thought of Eleanor, and a wave of profound, aching sadness washed over me. I wished she could have been here, not to witness our son's humiliation, but to help bear the weight of this raw and painful birth of truth. She would have known what to do, what to feel. I, on my own, felt only a vast and weary emptiness, a sorrow for the boy he had been, and for the man he had just discovered he was. After a period of time that had no measurement, I felt a subtle shift in the room, a sense that the initial shock was beginning to recede, leaving something else in its place. It was time. Slowly, deliberately, I released my grip on the windowsill and I turned around. The man sitting at my kitchen table was not the man who had walked through my door an hour ago. That man, the confident, successful whirlwind of a man, was gone. In his place sat a stranger, hunched and diminished, his shoulders slumped in a way that seemed to pull his entire frame inward. His expensive travel clothes, which had looked so sharp and effortless before, now seemed like an ill-fitting costume, a shell that had been vacated by its owner. His head was bowed, and he was staring intently at his own hands, which lay palms up on his knees. They were clean, manicured hands, the hands of a man who worked with numbers and ideas. They were nothing like my own. He seemed to be studying them as if they were foreign objects he had never seen before. The powerful, almost arrogant aura that had always surrounded him had completely evaporated, leaving behind a vacuum of profound and visible shame. He looked in that moment, not like a captain of industry, but like a small lost boy. He must have sensed my gaze, because he slowly lifted his head. Our eyes met across the space of the room. I had prepared myself for anything, for anger, for denial, for tears, for accusations. I was prepared for none of what I saw. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no defiance. There was only a vast, deep, bottomless ocean of comprehension. It was a look of pure, unadulterated horror, the look of a man who has just been shown a true and undeniable reflection of his own soul and is shattered by what he has seen. In his gaze, I saw the dawning, sickening understanding of the scale of his own blindness, the sheer, staggering weight of the life he had so casually negated. For an instant, I saw past the 45-year-old man, and I saw the 7-year-old boy to whom I had given the mug. the boy who had believed I was the best dad in the world. The two figures seemed to occupy the same space, the man's terrible new knowledge superimposed over the boy's innocent ignorance. I held his gaze. I did not offer pity. I did not offer comfort. I did not offer a triumphant, unspoken, "I told you so." I simply stood there and bore witness. I was the keeper of this truth, and my final duty was to watch, unflinchingly, as it was finally received. The moment could not hold. It was too raw, too heavy with the weight of unspoken decades. He broke eye contact first, his gaze falling back to his own hands. He needed to escape. The room, the house, my very presence. It had all become a torture chamber for him. His movements were stiff, robotic, devoid of their usual fluid grace. He stood up from the chair. He walked to the coffee table where the open box still sat. With a strange mechanical precision, he picked up the blue ledger, placed it back onto the velvet lining, and fitted the lid back into place. He did not leave the box behind. He did not reject it. He took it. He lifted it with both hands, its weight now his to carry. He turned, and without a single word, without another glance in my direction, he walked out of the front door, leaving it open behind him. I heard his heavy, shuffling footsteps on the porch, the frantic crunch of his shoes on the gravel driveway. A car door opened and closed. The engine started with an angry roar, a stark contrast to the profound silence he had left behind. The sound of the tires, spitting gravel as he accelerated away, faded into the distance. And then, there was silence once more. But it was a new kind of silence. It was clean. It was light. It was the quiet, peaceful air that settles over a landscape after a great and terrible storm has finally passed. The battle was over, and I was still standing. In the immediate aftermath, after the sound of his car had completely dissolved into the vast, indifferent silence of the Maine woods, the house felt unnervingly large and empty. But it was a clean, hollowed-out emptiness, like a vessel that has been scoured and rinsed of a long-settled stain. The air itself seemed lighter, easier to breathe. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in a way they hadn't before. I went to the dining table, where the sad remnants of that last, terrible meal still sat, a ghostly tableau of my humiliation. Without hesitation, I began to clear it away. I scraped the cold, congealed food from the china plates. I stripped the linens from the table. I washed and dried and polished Eleanor's silver. The simple, methodical act of restoring order was a balm to my spirit. I was not just cleaning a room. I was reclaiming my home, cleansing it of the toxic residue of a long-held injustice. When I was finished, the house was immaculate, returned to its quiet, dignified state. And for the first time in a very long time, it felt entirely my own. The days that followed fell into their old, familiar rhythm, but the rhythm itself felt different. I still woke before the sun. I still drank my bitter coffee at the kitchen table. I still spent my days in the workshop below. But a fundamental shift had occurred within me. The routines were no longer a bulwark against a rising tide of bitterness, a way to mark the passage of a lonely and unappreciated existence. They were simply the way I chose to live my life. A quiet joy began to seep back into the small corners of my world. I found myself noticing things again, details that had been rendered invisible by the gray fog of my resentment. I saw the intricate, iridescent beauty in a pigeon's feather on the lawn. I tasted the full, rich flavor of the coffee on my tongue. I felt the profound pleasure of a chisel's edge as it sliced cleanly through a piece of cherry wood, the curl of the shaving a perfect, fragrant spiral. The world, which had seemed so muted and faded, was slowly regaining its color. Weeks passed. There were no phone calls, no letters, no emails. There was only a profound and unbroken silence from Robert's end of the world. In the first few days, I had braced myself for it. expecting a call of anger or a stilted, difficult conversation. But as the silence stretched from days into a week, and then 2, I realized that I was not holding my breath. I was not waiting. The peace I had found was not a conditional peace, dependent on his apology or his understanding. It was my own. I had done what I had to do, not for him, but for me, and for the memory of the life I had built with Eleanor. I had taken the shapeless, agonizing truth of my past, and I had given it a beautiful, honest form. I had honored my own story. That, I discovered, was enough. My inner victory was not in his defeat, but in my own liberation. I was no longer defined by his perception of me. I had reclaimed my own narrative, and I found that it was a story I could live with in peace. One Tuesday afternoon, a month to the day after Robert had left with the box, the mail truck left a small square package on my porch. It was professionally wrapped in plain brown paper, the address printed on a neat white label. I felt no particular surge of anticipation as I carried it inside. I assumed it was a book I had forgotten ordering, or perhaps a catalog. I sat at the kitchen table and cut the tape with my pocket knife. Inside, there was a great deal of protective padding, and nestled within it was a carefully constructed box from a custom framing shop in Boston. My heart, which had been so steady, gave a slight, traitorous flutter. I lifted the object out. It was a picture frame, simple and unadorned, but I knew at a glance that it was a work of extraordinary quality. The wood was bird's eye maple, the same wood I had used for the box, and the metered corners were so perfectly joined they seemed to have grown that way. The grain shimmered under the kitchen light. It was a quiet, profound acknowledgement, a message sent in my own language. My eyes then went to the image protected behind the glass. It was a photograph I had never seen before. It was of me, sitting in my old armchair in the living room. At my feet on the floor were Lily and Jake. It must have been taken during their last tense visit, but this captured moment held none of that tension. The grandchildren were not looking at their phones. They were looking up at me, their faces full of a rare, unguarded curiosity. I had a hand raised, my finger pointing, and I could remember with a sudden, startling clarity the exact moment. I had been telling them the story of how a particular knot in the pine floorboards looked like the profile of a wolf if you looked at it just right. They had been, for that one brief instant, completely captivated. It was a picture of a moment I hadn't even realized was significant. A small island of genuine connection in a sea of familial distance. It was a picture of me, not as a relic, not as a functionary, but as a grandfather. I held the framed photograph in my hands, and I understood. There would be no letter of apology, no grand emotional phone call. There would not be the kind of reckoning that happens in movies. There would only be this quiet, beautiful, and deeply intentional gesture. The frame was his acknowledgement of my world, of the value of a thing made slowly and with care. The photograph was his acknowledgement of my place in his world, in his family. It was his way of saying, without words, the only thing that truly mattered. I see you now. It was not an erasure of the past, but it was a promise for the future, a promise to look closer, a promise to pay attention. It was a beginning. I took the photograph down to my workshop. The afternoon sun was streaming through the high windows, illuminating the familiar dusty air with shafts of golden light. I cleared a space on a shelf next to my most treasured hand planes and a small, intricate carving of a songbird I had made for Eleanor years ago. I placed the frame there. It did not look out of place. It looked like it belonged. I stood for a moment, looking at the image of myself with my grandchildren, and I felt a sense of peace so deep and so complete that it felt like coming home after a long and arduous journey. I then turned back to my workbench. I picked up a small, clean block of basswood and my favorite carving knife. I was not working on a commission or a project with a deadline. I was simply working for the joy of it. As the knife made its first clean cut, sending a small white curl of wood falling to the bench, I was not thinking about my son. I was not waiting for his next call. I was simply here, in my sanctuary, the scent of wood in the air, the familiar weight of the tool in my hand, the quiet, steady rhythm of my own life restored. The victory had been won, not in a confrontation, but in the silence. And the new dawn was not a fiery sunrise, but this, the gentle quiet and peaceful light of an ordinary afternoon.